A woman suffering from severe depression was on the verge of doing something irreversible. But when she turned around and saw her son, who had been missing for 2 years, Tilda didn't want to live anymore. She was already 63 years old, and life seemed empty and meaningless to her. All those she loved had gone, leaving her alone with her memories and unbearable silence. Her husband, Simon, her rock and support, had died many years ago while hurrying to pick her up from the maternity hospital. He had been killed in a car accident, and from that moment, her life had been divided into before and after. She had managed to survive that loss because she had her son, Arnold, her only child, her reason for living and her joy. But 20 years ago, he, too, left this world, failing to keep his promise to return from the war alive. She no longer heard his laughter, no longer saw his smile, and each day reminded her of the bottomless void. What a tragedy for a mother to lose her child. And even more horrifying was having to bury an empty coffin, the body left somewhere far away in a mass grave, never found. A year later, she lost the last person close to her, her older brother. Gregory died of a heart attack, leaving her completely alone. From that day on, the world lost all color for her. Her life turned into a slow existence devoid of warmth or hope. Tilda was left alone with her pain, which only grew stronger with each passing day. At first, people tried to help her. Neighbors and acquaintances, seeing her suffering, came to her home, trying to support her with kind words, bringing food, inviting her for walks to distract her from her heavy thoughts. They knew about her loss and tried to prevent her from sinking into the abyss of loneliness. Some came just to talk, some offered help around the house, and others tried to engage her in conversations about the past, about the times when life was filled with joy and laughter. They tried to keep her from shutting herself off, to fill her days with communication and care. But then people gave up, just as Tilda herself had given up. With each passing day, her detachment became more apparent. She opened the door less frequently, answered calls and invitations with decreasing enthusiasm. Gradually, the visits dwindled and eventually stopped altogether. People saw that nothing interested her anymore, that she was living on autopilot, without the slightest desire to fight for her happiness or even for some relief from her plight. "Tilda?" A woman stood with her ear pressed to the door. "Tilda, it's Monica. I know you're in a lot of pain, but..." She sighed heavily. In her heart, she felt how hard it was for the lonely old woman, but in her mind, she understood that this couldn't go on any longer. Monica had been coming to see her almost every day. She had known Tilda since childhood, they had gone to the same school. Tilda used to be cheerful and optimistic. After Simon's death, she still had the will to live. But the last few years had not brought any joy. Monica had her own family, her own life. She couldn't stay with her old friend any longer. "Tilda, I can't do this anymore. You're not fighting. And dragging you out of this pit by force, it's too hard." Monica pressed her lips together. "I've just had my third grandchild. My family needs me, my children need me. If you ever want to meet, you can always come to me. I'll be glad to see you." It was very hard to turn away from Tilda, but it had to be done. Monica felt that she was sinking with her. The atmosphere of despair and depression had become suffocating. Over all these years, Monica had stopped finding joy in life the way she used to. It was time to move on. "I left a bag on the doorknob. Goodbye, Tilda." This happens in adult life. Paths diverge. It's completely normal to leave someone behind when you want to move out of stagnation. "Goodbye, Monica," Tilda whispered softly, standing by the door the whole time. She understood her. The lonely old woman continued to exist. She ate, slept, went to the hospital, to the store. She did everything ordinary people do, but there was no life in her actions, no real meaning. Everything happened mechanically, as if by a set schedule. Each day was like the one before, and nothing could change that dreary, endless cycle. Tilda was like a shadow of herself, living out of inertia, without desire or purpose. When her brother was alive, the burden wasn't as heavy. His presence was the anchor that kept her afloat in the turbulent sea of loss and grief. Gregory was everything to her, a strong, supportive shoulder to lean on when things became too difficult. His voice, his calm demeanor, his care were the threads that connected her to life, giving her existence meaning. "Oh, Greg," Tilda sighed heavily, running her weakened fingers over the family portrait, "you promised to stay by my side. Why did you leave me?" Sometimes she would pick up an old photo album and just leaf through it. She would look at pictures of a happy past, remembering the days when life didn't seem like poison. Here she was with Simon standing in front of a car. Tilda was so young here, pregnant. Here, Greg is holding little Ernie in his arms. He had become the boy's father, a father he never got to meet. Graduation, farewell to the army. There they were with Gregory's family, he already had grandchildren. Now no one cared about old Tilda. Everyone had forgotten her. As if she had never existed, as if she had never been anyone's aunt, great-aunt, or relative. As long as Greg was alive, she had a family. Every day, while he was alive, Tilda knew that somewhere nearby there was a person who breathed the same air, walked the same streets, and shared the same memories. He was her support, the one who helped bear the weight of losses and memories, making it a little lighter. He was the one who reminded her that she wasn't alone in this world, that she still had a kindred soul with whom she could share her thoughts and feelings. But now that was gone. They all had gone. First her husband, then her son, and now her brother. They left, taking with them warmth, comfort, and a sense of closeness. With each departure, her world became emptier, colder. All that was left was her, a frail old woman, forgotten by everyone. Now she was alone in her old apartment, which had once been full of life and laughter, but had now become quiet and lifeless. Every corner reminded her of the past, of those who had left and left her behind. Her hands, once busy caring for loved ones, now lay helplessly in her lap, not knowing how to occupy themselves. Her heart, which once beat in unison with those she loved, now barely flickered, like a dying fire. Eating became increasingly difficult. Each meal turned into a torment. The food that once brought some comfort now tasted bland. Tilda stared at the plate before her, at the spoon or fork in her trembling hands, and couldn't force herself to take even the first bite. The food seemed to get stuck in her throat, refusing to go down, as if her body was rejecting this essential need for life. Sometimes she just sat at the table, staring into the void, forgetting about the food that remained untouched. The only thing she could easily swallow were the pills. Tilda understood perfectly well that everything happening to her was wrong. The last of her willpower was spent making an appointment with a specialist. "Well, Mrs. Jackson," began the man in neat glasses, "I see there hasn't been any improvement. Are you sure you're taking your medication?" The psychiatrist she visited had long ceased to be a source of any comfort. In his office, she felt even more alone than at home. He said nothing new, his words were empty, like the pills he prescribed over and over again. Those pills, lying in neat rows on her bedside table, no longer seemed like salvation. They were a reminder of how deep her sorrow had gone and how little anyone understood what was happening inside her soul. "Yes, Mr. Simmons." Exactly as instructed, the old woman replied monotonously. Each visit to the psychiatrist turned into a routine. He asked the same questions, and she gave the same answers. His eyes expressed nothing but professional detachment, as if she were just another entry in his schedule, another checkmark on a long list of tasks. He looked at her, but it seemed he didn't see her. He didn't see her suffering, her inner emptiness, her slow fading away. "Do you have any new complaints?" "I can't make myself eat." The woman clasped her wrist and lowered her gaze to the floor. "Everything tastes bland and disgusting. I've lost a lot of weight in the past 6 months." Mr. Simmons made a note in his notepad. An awkward, uncomfortable silence hung in the office. The man cleared his throat and raised his indifferent gray eyes to the patient. Against the backdrop of the dark brown oak cabinet, he looked like a real hallucination, pale, almost transparent, in an old-fashioned suit. He was only slightly younger than Tilda. In that case, I suggest increasing the dosage. The medication should help put you in a more positive state of mind. Also, I advise you to start taking that antidepressant again, it should invigorate you. He prescribed the same medications as always, as if they could change something. But they didn't help. They couldn't bring back her lost loved ones, couldn't fill her home with life and laughter, couldn't banish the unbearable heaviness from her heart that grew stronger every day. Sometimes it seemed to her that he wasn't even interested in her health. As if her suffering was just a tedious obligation for him, something he couldn't wait to be rid of. After each visit to the doctor, she returned home even more broken and empty than before. She saw that there was no salvation for her, that no one could help her cope with the burden she carried in her heart. All she could do was continue living this joyless existence, day after day, week after week, with the feeling that she was drowning in her own despair, with no one around to offer her a hand. When she got home, Tilda felt only overwhelming exhaustion. She barely managed to take a shower and immediately collapsed onto her bed. Her eyelids were weighed down by a leaden heaviness. She was quickly pulled into sleep. In her dream, Tilda found herself in a house she immediately recognized. It was their old country cottage, where the family had spent the best years of their lives. Sunlight gently filtered through the windows, filling the room with a warm golden light. The air was filled with the light scent of blooming apple trees, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed. "You can't catch me, you can't catch me," laughed a child's voice. "Oh, really? You think so?" a man playfully responded, and in that moment, Tilda's heart was pierced with a sharp pang. It was a familiar voice. A voice she had begun to forget. She stood by the kitchen table, where freshly baked pies lay on the tablecloth. Her heart felt astonishingly light, as if all the worries and heaviness of the past years had vanished. Laughter echoed from the next room, and Tilda, guided by the sound, approached the door. When she entered the room, tears welled up in her eyes. Before her stood those she had mourned for so long. Simon sat in his favorite chair, smiling at her with the same warm smile she remembered from their early days. His eyes shone with warmth and joy. Arnold, her boy, no longer as young as she remembered him but still just as energetic, was running around, playing tag with his cousins. Tilda remembered how much Ernie loved children. Gregory, her brother, stood by the window, gazing thoughtfully into the distance, but when he saw his sister, his face broke into a broad smile. "Tilda, dear, it's so good that you came," he said, reaching out his hand to her. She felt the warmth of his hand, as if it were real. The sensation was so vivid that it took her breath away. Arnold ran up to her, hugged her, and pressed his unshaven cheek to hers, just as he did in his childhood when he sought comfort. Tilda stroked his hair, feeling the softness of his curls. Gregory came closer and hugged her shoulders as if protecting her from the world. The feeling was so familiar that Tilda felt tears welling up in her eyes. But these tears were not filled with bitterness and sorrow, they were tears of joy and relief. She felt the burden of loneliness and loss leaving her, replaced by a warm, bright emptiness. "We're all here, Tilda. And we'll always be with you," Simon whispered. Tilda stood among her loved ones, savoring the moment, absorbing every word, every look. This was where she had always wanted to be, among her family, surrounded by love and warmth. It seemed to her that this was true paradise, and that she needed nothing more. "Please, stay with us," Simon whispered softly in her ear, wrapping his arms around his wife. "We've missed you so much." She woke up earlier than usual, and her eyes were wet with tears. At first, she didn't understand what was happening, but then the memories of her dream came flooding back. In the dream, Tilda saw her family, her husband, son, brother. They were all there, in that distant, cozy place filled with light and warmth. They smiled at her, their faces glowing with joy, and she felt a long-forgotten sense of peace and happiness reignite in her heart. The dream was so real that, upon waking, she momentarily thought it had all been true. But reality quickly pulled her back into the cold, lonely room. The emptiness surrounding her seemed even more oppressive after she had briefly immersed herself in that world of illusions, where everything was as it should be. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. It pained her to realize it was just a dream, yet at the same time, she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though she was being called to a place where she could be with them again, where loneliness and sorrow would no longer torment her. Maybe this is the right thing to do? This thought gradually took root in her mind, and the more she pondered it, the clearer it became. It was time. Time to join those she had waited for so long. She felt that her time on this earth had come to an end, and there was nothing left for her here. She had lived her life, and now, with everything she held dear left in the past, it seemed natural to leave for a place where peace awaited her. At least, who cares about me? No one will suffer if I'm gone. Tilda quickly wiped away the tears that blurred her view of the modest surroundings of her apartment. I've suffered enough. That's enough. It's time to rest. She slowly got out of bed, feeling her way to the table where she kept her old notebooks and pens. With trembling hands, she pulled out a sheet of paper and sat down to write a farewell note. She sat there for a long time, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want anyone to see her decision as a sign of weakness or an act of despair. No, she wanted her departure to be seen as something natural, the logical conclusion of a long journey. She wrote that she was leaving all her belongings to her niece's daughter, though she knew they didn't care about her. But despite that, she wanted to leave the girl something good, something that might bring her joy. She remembered when the girl used to visit her, how they walked together and ate pies, how the girl laughed when Tilda told her stories from her youth. These memories were among the few warm moments in the last years of her life, and she wanted her final gesture to be something kind. Don't misunderstand me. Tilda Jackson, she whispered to herself as she carefully traced the letters. As she finished the letter, she felt a strange calmness. It seemed to her that she had done everything right, that now everything would be okay. Folding the sheet in half, she placed it on the table where it could easily be found. The old woman spent a long time thinking about how to do everything so that no one would interfere with her decision. She decided not to lock the apartment door behind her so that it wouldn't have to be broken down when those who discovered her absence arrived. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were carrying out a long-planned task. Once ready, Tilda put on her old coat, the same one she wore in her youth when she and her husband walked in the park. It was gray-beige, of an old style. It had worn out over time, but still provided warmth. The old woman left the apartment, quietly closing the door behind her. She walked down the long, dark corridor, passing the doors of other apartments, from which sounds of life sometimes emerged, children's laughter, the hum of a television, quiet conversations. But it all seemed foreign to her, as if she no longer belonged to this world. She climbed the stairs to the roof, and with each step, her heart beat more calmly. Tilda felt she was getting closer to her goal. Once on the roof, Tilda paused for a moment to take in her surroundings. The cold wind, filled with the scent of the city's bustle, gently ruffled her gray hair. The city stretched out before her, illuminated by the evening lights. Cars scurried along the streets like little ants, and people, like shadows, flitted below, busy with their daily routines. She was alone here, with only this vast panorama that seemed as empty as her soul. She slowly approached the edge of the roof, where a low concrete parapet stood. Her hands rested on the cold stone, and she felt a shiver run through her body. The old woman stared at the ground for a long time, watching the wind swirl the autumn leaves falling from the trees. She waited until the people below became less frequent, until the street was empty enough that her departure would cause as little inconvenience as possible. Minutes passed, but they felt like an eternity. An unbearable melancholy grew inside her, squeezing her heart with an iron grip. It seemed to her that this world no longer had anything to do with her, that her time here had run out. And then, at some point, she understood, it was time. Just wait a little longer, my beloved ones, she whispered to her departed family. The old woman slowly lifted one foot and carefully placed it on the concrete parapet. She stood there, balancing as if on the brink between life and death. The wind picked up, as if urging her on, but she did not rush. Tilda moved her other foot forward, ready to take the final step. Her gaze was fixed in the distance, somewhere beyond the horizon, where she believed her family was waiting for her. And suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by something unexpected. "Excuse me." The old woman, who was just about to take the decisive step, felt the ground slip away from under her feet. The wind howled in her ears, and emptiness flashed before her eyes. But at the last moment, something stopped her. She shuddered and quickly turned around, barely keeping her balance. At that moment, her gaze met pairs of eyes she never expected to see. Before her stood her son, young, full of life, just as she remembered him before that dreadful day when he was taken from her forever. His eyes, wide with fear and confusion, looked directly at her. That look was just the same as when, as a little boy, he would ask her to stay with him in the room at night, afraid of the dark. But this couldn't be. Her son had been dead for 20 years. And behind him, like a small ghost, stood a girl holding a basket. The old woman's mind was in turmoil. She couldn't understand what was happening. Her lips began to move soundlessly, and then she started to mutter, as if afraid that this moment would vanish like a mirage. "My boy," she whispered, "you've come back. I missed you so much, my son." Her voice trembled, filled with all the years of loneliness and longing she had endured since he was gone. Tilda held onto his hand, gripping it as if her life depended on it. She looked at him with a mix of despair and hope, as if she couldn't believe he was here, next to her, alive. "Sunshine, how is this possible? Am I already?" Tilda's eyes, red from tears, opened wide. "Am I already dead?" The young man stood still, shocked and bewildered. He had no idea what to do in this situation. He had come here with one goal, to spend a romantic evening with his girlfriend in a quiet, secluded place, to gaze at the city from above. "No, ma'am, you're alive," the young man said awkwardly. Instead of enjoying the evening lights of the city and quiet conversations, he found himself in a situation that could make anyone contemplate the meaning of life and death. The old woman, it seemed, had tried to end her life, and he just couldn't walk away. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but he didn't know what to say. What could you say to someone who was holding your hand as if it were their last hope for salvation and calling you their son? "Ma'am, I don't really understand what's happening. You see, this is the first time I've seen you. I just couldn't pass by." The girl with the basket stood a little off to the side, not daring to come closer. She too was stunned by what was happening. Her evening, which was supposed to be romantic and carefree, had turned into some kind of nightmare. She saw the old woman, so touchingly and desperately clinging to her boyfriend, and didn't know how to react. The situation was strange and confusing, but at the same time, her heart ached for this lonely woman who seemed to have completely lost touch with reality. Tilda, still in a state of shock, raised her tear-filled, slightly crazed eyes to the young man. Her gaze was full of fear, despair, and a sudden hope that fate had decided to return the most precious thing she had ever lost. Despite her state, she understood that something wasn't quite right here. Her trembling lips barely managed to form the words. "What's your name, son?" The young man, unsure of how to respond to her strange behavior, hesitantly replied. "My name is David." The name hung in the air, like an echo of long-gone years. The woman froze, straining her memory, trying to find a connection between the name and the face looking at her. But it wasn't the name she expected to hear. Her son's name was Arnold. Arnold Jackson. Tilda dared to ask one more question, hiding all her hope within it. "What was your father's name? What is his last name?" She asked this as if trying to grasp the last thread leading to the truth. Her voice trembled, and her heart stood still in anticipation. The young man, sensing how important this question was to her, answered with slight confusion. "My father's name was Arnold, I think." "Yes, my mom said his name was Arnold Jackson." Upon hearing these words, the woman felt something shift inside her. That name, that surname. Her son, her dear son, had the same surname. David looked at her, confused, not realizing the significance of what he had said, while she suddenly understood that the person standing before her was not just a young man, but her own, yet unfamiliar, grandson. She couldn't contain herself and, with excitement and love, rushed to embrace him. "My grandson, you're my grandson," she whispered, hugging him so tightly as if afraid he would disappear, dissolve into the air like a ghost. She felt his warmth, his living flesh, and it confirmed what she was already beginning to believe: fate had given her a miracle. David, still not fully understanding what was happening, felt something stir inside him as well. He cautiously returned the old woman's embrace, feeling her trembling shoulders gradually calm down. This moment was both touching and strange, his heart filled with a feeling he couldn't quite explain. Meanwhile, the girl standing nearby couldn't hide her emotions. She watched what was happening with a mix of surprise and tenderness, realizing that this random evening had changed the lives of all three of them. She stepped closer and placed her hand on the old woman's shoulder, as if confirming that she was not alone anymore. Maybe we should get off the roof," the girl timidly suggested. A few minutes later, all three were sitting in the old woman's small, cozy apartment. Cups of tea were cooling on the table, and no one knew what to say. Each was lost in their own thoughts. The woman pondered the miraculous turn of fate, the young man was still trying to comprehend how he ended up here, and the girl felt the thin thread of an invisible bond increasingly unite them into one. In this silence, filled with unspoken words and unfinished emotions, there was more than just quiet. It was a time of realization and acceptance that sometimes life can offer the most unexpected gifts. The air was heavy with an awkward, tense silence, like an unsolved knot that no one dared to untangle. The glances of all three occasionally met, but none could hold it for long. Everyone understood that behind this silent pause lay many unasked questions, like a bubbling stream ready to break through, but each was afraid to take the first step. The young man sitting across from the elderly woman felt the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. In his mind, questions kept surfacing. Why had he never known about his grandmother's existence? Why had his mother, with whom he had always had a close relationship, never mentioned her? His thoughts were tangled, making it impossible to piece together a logical picture. Could it be that his mother was so afraid of memories from the past that she decided to erase this woman, her own shadow, from her life? But was that fair? Wasn't it cruel to deprive a grandmother of the right to communicate with her grandson? Okay, if not communication, at least the right to know about his existence. Deep down, the young man felt that what had happened couldn't just be left as it was. "Ma'am." "Tilda, my dear, my name is Tilda." David averted his eyes in embarrassment. He couldn't just start calling her grandma like that, but he saw how much she would want him to. "Tilda, can you explain why you believe I'm your grandson?" He awkwardly rubbed his neck. "My mom never told me about my father or his life. She just said that their paths diverged, and that was it." He glanced again at the elderly woman sitting across from him. Her eyes, reflecting a weariness from life, seemed to plead with him to help her understand why fate had been so cruel. The young man realized that he simply had to call his mother. Questions were mounting in his mind, demanding answers, and he knew that only his mother could shed light on this mysterious story. "Wait, dear, I have something to show you," Tilda said, as if reading his thoughts. She carefully reached for the shelf and took out an old, dusty photo album. Her hands trembled as she opened the album and placed it on her lap, as if she were holding something sacred. There was a sense of reverence in her movements, and the young people sitting nearby instinctively moved closer, their eyes glued to the yellowed pages. The old woman slowly turned the pages, showing photographs that captured moments long gone but still so important to her. In one of the pictures was her son, still very young, with an open smile and a sparkle in his eyes that painfully reminded her of the times when life seemed full of possibilities. The young people leaned in to get a better look, and Sheila gasped quietly in surprise. "David, he's just like you." She shook the young man by the shoulder. "This can't be real." The boy in the photograph bore an astonishing resemblance to the young man sitting beside her. The same last name, the same first name, the same appearance. This couldn't be a simple coincidence. All doubts vanished. Before them was undeniable proof that they were connected by blood, despite years of separation and the secrets their mother had kept hidden. My Ernie went off to the front. I tried to talk him out of it, we argued, but he wouldn't listen. Tilda began her difficult story. I don't know what drove him there. He was always a secretive one. Sometimes it was hard to get a word out of him when he was in a bad mood. And when one day he just started packing his things, he was furious. I never found out why, what made him decide to go. Less than a year later, he was gone. My little angel. Tilda pursed her lips to hold back her tears. She had already cried too many over the years. She was tired of carrying the burden of grief and pain. It was time to focus on happier thoughts. This is just awful, Tilda, Sheila said sympathetically, placing a hand on the old woman's shoulder. He was so young. It's terrifying to lose a child. The girl gently touched the young man's hand, nudging him toward action. She knew there was a truth hidden in this moment that needed to be uncovered to piece everything together. The young man nodded, gathering his courage, and slowly reached for his phone. He knew that calling his mother might be a challenge for both of them, but he also understood that it needed to be done. Answers were necessary, not only for the elderly woman who had lived in ignorance for so long, but also for himself. The conversation was not easy. The phone connection added a strange distance, making each minute feel like an hour. At first, his mother didn't understand what he was talking about. She interrupted, asking questions, as if hoping to find some inconsistency in his words that would dispel this absurd situation. But her son was persistent, and the more he explained, the more anxiety could be felt on the other end of the line. Mom, you don't understand. Her name is Tilda Jackson. David was now speaking in a frustrated rush. And her son's name was Arnold. Mom, Arnold. She showed me pictures. I look like I just stepped out of them. No, son, your father never introduced me to his relatives. This is all just nonsense. It's some kind of bizarre coincidence. His mother couldn't believe that this was really happening, that her son, who seemed to have just decided to spend an evening with a girl, was now entangled in such complex family ties. As the son described the events, his mother's voice became more tense, and her questions more pointed and sharp. They both knew there was no turning back, that they had to uncover the truth, despite the fear of what this investigation might reveal. Just come here, the young man nearly shouted. Come, look at this album, see the old clothes Tilda has left from her son. Just come and see all this, talk to Tilda. An hour later, which felt like an eternity, the young man's mother stood at the threshold of the apartment where all the participants in this complicated drama had gathered. Her eyes revealed a mix of anxiety and disbelief. She glanced around as if expecting someone to announce that this was all a joke. But reality was harsh. Before her sat an elderly woman, with whom she shared much more than mere coincidence. Hello, Tilda? Jenny greeted quietly. May I come in? Of course, dear, come in, don't be shy. The old woman bustled around the new guest and led her to the kitchen. Sweetheart, there's so much I need to tell you. And so much you need to tell me. As they settled in the kitchen, the atmosphere resembled a courtroom. The young man and his girlfriend exchanged glances, waiting to hear what the mother would say. The room was filled with a tense silence that weighed on everyone present. They flipped through the photo album again. Then Tilda pulled out some old clothes that Arnold used to wear from an old suitcase. Mrs. Jackson retold her story several times. Jenny had no choice but to stop running from the obvious truth. Tilda was her almost mother-in-law. And you, dear? Tilda brought a glass of water closer to the woman. What will you tell us? After all, Ernie was quite the silent type. I want to know why I knew nothing about you, how it all came to be. Jenny raised her tearful eyes to those around her. There stood her son. He clearly wanted answers. Sheila, sitting nearby in a cozy wicker chair, had become like family to them. Her curiosity was palpable. And Tilda. Tilda was a woman who had lived so many years without a family. And Jenny understood her. She took a generous sip from the glass. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she couldn't find the right words. But she knew she had to start somehow. Taking a deep breath, she wiped her face, trying to shake off the shock and numbness. It happened 22 years ago. The young man's mother, still stunned by what she had heard, began her story. Her voice trembled, but as she spoke, it became clear that she had been ready for this moment for a long time, even if she hadn't realized it. She started from the very beginning, when, 22 years ago, she met a young man who had literally turned her life upside down. He was handsome, charismatic, with a spark that instantly captivated. They fell in love, and their relationship developed quickly. Youth, passion, plans for the future, it all seemed so real, so tangible. Ernie was unstoppable. He barreled through life like a freight train, afraid of nothing. Jenny smiled painfully. That's what won me over. With him, I felt like nothing in the world mattered or was scary. Men like him are born once in a century, as my mother used to say. But when we started talking about the future, everything changed. We began to argue terribly. They were making plans, dreaming of their wedding, but life turned out to be less kind. The time came to part ways. Arnold wanted to sign a contract and head to a war zone. He saw it as a chance to secure their future, to earn the money that would allow them to live comfortably. But Jenny was against it, her heart clenched with fear at the mere thought of what could happen to him. She knew that war wasn't just an opportunity to make money, it was playing with fire, and one could be consumed by it without a trace. He just wouldn't listen to me, you understand? I understand, darling, I understand perfectly. Tilda took Jenny's hand in hers so she wouldn't feel alone with her heavy memories. I was terrified when I found out about the contract. I couldn't find peace. That was our Ernie, stubborn, hard-headed. Just like Arnold. Jenny looked at the old woman with sincere gratitude for the brief respite her comment provided. Yes, that was their Ernie, brave in his courage and terrible in his haste. The woman let out a long sigh and continued her story. One day, he came to the park as we had arranged. He already had that damn cap on his head, as if he was proud to be going to the slaughter. Jenny quickly sniffled. I started begging him again to break the contract. But he just got angry. He began talking about the opportunities we would have when he returned, about some money. I didn't believe any of it. I just wanted my Ernie to be with me. But he wanted to prove something, I think, to himself. That day, we didn't hold back in what we said. And so they quarreled. Her fear and his determination collided head-on, and at that moment, they were both too young and stubborn to find a compromise. The argument flared up suddenly, but the words they exchanged in anger left deep wounds. Each wanted to prove their point, not noticing how everything they had built together was crumbling. In the end, they went their separate ways, each carrying with them bitterness and regret. She tried to forget him, to start a new life, but memories wouldn't let her go. Now, sitting in this small kitchen, facing the truth, she realized that all this time she had been hiding the truth from herself, not wanting to face it. But denying the obvious no longer made sense. She saw in the old woman's eyes her own pain and understood that before her was a part of her past, returned to force her to make this confession. I didn't even know he had died, you understand? He never wrote to me. I thought it was over, that I had been erased from his life, as if I had never been part of it. The woman hugged herself tightly. I didn't know his parents' address or their phone number when I found out I was pregnant. I was just so hurt by Ernie that I decided, to hell with it, I can raise the child on my own. But now I know what happened. God, I didn't even know about the funeral. This realization hit her heart especially hard. No one invited her to say a final goodbye to her beloved. She was absolutely convinced that he had simply left her life, without forgiving that last quarrel, that cold break that had split their world in two. Every day she lived with this pain, with this confusion. She raised her son alone, watching him grow up with bitterness and longing, trying to give him everything she could. She felt that this little boy was the only thing left to her after that argument. She protected him as best she could, pouring all her love into him, trying to fill the void that had formed in her life after his father's departure. Years passed, but the wound never healed. She couldn't shake the thought that he was out there somewhere, living his life, possibly having found someone else, building a new family. She tried to push these thoughts away, telling herself she had to focus on her son, on making his life happy, but every morning and every evening she thought of him. She wondered why he never returned, why he didn't try to contact her, why he gave no sign. This question tormented her soul, giving her no peace, day or night. Jenny tried not to show this to her son, but he felt her pain, felt that his mother was living with some unexpressed burden on her heart. She didn't want him to know the truth, didn't want him to think that his father had abandoned them. Deep down, she still hoped that one day he would return, that he would come, hold her in his arms, and tell her that it was all a mistake, that he had always loved her. But the years went by, and that hope became more and more elusive, more and more distant. She immersed herself in work and caring for her son, trying to dull the pain, but it only faded slightly, remaining deep inside, like a smoldering ember that could not be extinguished. "Jenny, sweetheart, come here," Tilda said gently, in a motherly tone, spreading her arms for a hug. "It's all in the past. We can't bring our Ernie back, but now we're here, in one room. It's too late to mourn him, darling." The old woman couldn't hold back her tears. They rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, leaving wet tracks behind. She covered her mouth with her hand to keep her voice from trembling, so no one would hear how her heart was breaking from the pain she had carried all these years. Loss, grief, these words were not just sounds to her, but deep wounds that had never healed. Her husband, her only love, had left so suddenly, leaving her alone in this vast, empty world. She remembered that day when he didn't come back. How she sat by the window, waiting for his return. Tilda couldn't wait for the moment she would see his smile when he would stand at the door with a small bundle in his hands. But instead, the cold news came, shattering her heart into a million pieces. Simon had died, never managing to return to her, never getting to see his son. "What a foolish story, though," the old woman said with a bitter smile. "My Arnold lost his father while still a baby. And then his son. My grandson never knew what a father's love was either. What a foolish, cruel fate for our family." This loss was like a huge whirlpool that had consumed her. She tried to keep living for the child, but every day, every minute was soaked in pain and sorrow. She told herself she had to be strong, that she had to keep going for the sake of their son. But at night, when she was alone, she was overwhelmed by a wave of inconsolable grief. She kept replaying their last conversations in her head, remembering how he had promised to return, how they had dreamed of the future. "You know, Tilda, David could have had another grandmother all these years," the woman said, pressing closer to the old woman, feeling her warmth with all her heart and soul. "And I, foolishly, didn't even think to look for his relatives. I was hurt, like a little girl, and decided out of principle not to seek anyone out. When Arnold went to the army, young Jenny was left alone, burdened with resentment and disappointment. She didn't know his mother's phone number, and gradually their connection broke, like a thread stretched to the limit. She lived in her small world, built from memories and unfulfilled hopes, trying to find the strength to move on. But the feeling of loneliness became her constant companion. The decision to have a child for herself became her salvation. She decided she could raise him alone, without support, without help. She made plans on how she would raise her son, how she would teach him to be strong and independent. Her heart was full of love that she was ready to give to her child. If only she had known that somewhere in the same city lived a woman who so desperately needed family warmth, who had lost her son and sought solace in the emptiness of her apartment. The old lady sat in her chair, and her gaze shifted from the young woman to her son. David, sitting opposite, was her own grandson, the blood of her deceased son, Arnold. He resembled him so much, the same jawline, the same gaze, the same habits she had seen in her son many years ago. It seemed that fate, despite all its cruel blows, decided to give her a chance to feel love and family warmth again. Next to him sat Sheila, sweet, beautiful, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She clearly loved him, and it was visible in every movement and every look she cast at him. The old lady watched them, and her heart filled with warmth. She saw before her a future that she thought was already out of reach, something she no longer dared to dream about. Despite all the years that had passed, the old lady suddenly felt a desire to live awaken within her. These two, sitting before her, were not just random guests. They were people she could love, people she could care for. She once again had those for whom it was worth waking up in the morning, for whom she could cook meals, and to whom she could tell stories from the past. "You know," the old lady began, her voice soft and a little trembling, "when I look at you, David, it feels like time has turned back. You look so much like your father. Sometimes it even seems to me that it's him sitting in front of me." David slightly tilted his head, as if pondering her words. Now that everything hidden had come to light, these words carried a completely different weight. "I often heard from my mother that I resembled him, but I never thought it would sound like this. I don't even know. I never thought that this resemblance would be something important for the family." The old lady smiled, her eyes sparkling with lingering tears. She looked at Jenny, who was sitting at the table, tired, exhausted by the heavy monologue. But now her face was lit by a slight smile. It was as if a great burden of grief had suddenly fallen from her shoulders. And Tilda, clasping her hands together in a prayerful manner, again looked at her grandson. "It's important to me, very important. I thought I would never again see that gaze, that smile. But you're here, and it's like a gift from above." The old lady ran her hand through her gray hair. "But you are not a replacement for him, my dear. Not at all. You are a legacy. You are David, you are not your father's shadow. I don't see you that way." Sheila, sitting nearby, gently squeezed David's hand. "I can only imagine how hard it was for you, so many years alone, losing one loved one after another," she said, her voice quiet and heartfelt. "But now you can step out of the darkness. I don't think you'll be left alone anymore. Right, David?" The young man nodded expressively, agreeing with his beloved. The old lady looked at Sheila with gratitude and warmth. "You're such a kind, sweet girl. I see that you're happy together, and that makes me happy. I thought my life was already over, that I had nothing left to live for, but now you have us," Jenny gently interrupted her, smiling. "And we're here to stay. We're not going anywhere. We're now part of your life, Tilda." The old lady lowered her head, unable to hold back her tears. "Thank you. Thank you for finding me." David got up from his seat and moved closer to his grandmother. He himself was on the verge of tears. Too much had happened that evening. The young man knelt in front of the old lady and took her hands in his. "It's we who should thank you. You're part of our family, even if we didn't know it before. Now we have a chance to make up for lost time." David looked at the old lady with tenderness. "We won't replace those you've lost, but we can become your new family, if you'll let us." The old lady wiped her tears and looked at them with genuine love. "I will allow it. I very much want to be with you." And most importantly, she saw in their eyes the readiness to accept her love, her care. They were ready to love her in return, to give her that very sense of belonging to a family that she had so lacked all these years. This young man was not just her grandson, he was the new meaning of her life. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.